Sure, let's pray together. Gracious God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we're so grateful that you have made yourself known to us in Jesus Christ. And we're thankful that you enable us to gather together in various ways as we in faith seek understanding of all of who you are, all of what you have done, are doing, and will do. And we pray your blessing upon our time together here as we look at some of Torrance's writings and consider it. We pray that you would give us insight and patience and discernment and thanksgiving and appreciation that we might grow in our faith and hope and love in you and enable us to share that with others. And so, we commend ourselves to you, especially Kerry, at this time. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Gary. So today we are looking at chapter 4. Earlier this month, Travis took us through chapter 5 because, Kerry, we weren't able to take you out of the busyness of the season of Christmas and all that. So we're delighted to have you today, but we've had Travis in just a few weeks past, and next week will be chapter 6 with Paul Molnar. So it's a rich time for engaging the ground and grammar of theology. So thank you for being here today for this chapter. If you could just, mostly for people who aren't, I think everybody who's here knows you, but for people who might view in the future, could you just say a bit about why you are such an important person for helping us to walk through this chapter?
I'm a hobbit, so welcome to the Shire. And, yes, that's about it. So my corner of the Shire is professionally the history of science. So I'm not a theologian, and that's why I like hanging out with real theologians or more experienced people in theology. But I so appreciate and have been personally helped by T.F. Torrance and his vision for integrating the sciences and faith. And so it's been a real lifeline for me professionally as well as personally. And when I come at it, I'm speaking as a historian of science, and from that perspective, most of the time, but also personally as a believer committed to the Nicene tradition of Trinitarian faith. So anyway, maybe that's enough, but
that's a good place to start. So just to recognize that you are also a major contributor editor to the T.F. Torrance Participatio Journal, and so you are not distanced from the nature of theological work in being able to gather, edit, and get those things up, as well as the website. So I don't know what you need to qualify you as, not being part of the family or something. You've got this one step removed, and it's like, yeah, I think you're an important part of the theological family that is represented by the T.F. Torrance Fellowship. And so to say T.F. Torrance himself was a theologian who was quite engaged in the sciences, that he would not want to deny somebody who was a scientist who was also engaged in theological work the same dignity of both being scientist and theologian. So if I can confer that upon you, I would do that for you.
Oh, well, thanks so much. And when I first volunteered to Gary, when Gary was president of the fellowship to help out with the website, he made clear to me that even though theological is in the name, it's definitely inclusive and open to people in that theological tradition, no matter what discipline they're coming from. So that inclusiveness in the fellowship has been something that I think is really valuable and a source of vigor and renewal, hopefully, and strength over time. A fellowship with people with slightly different backgrounds interacting together always leads to a more dynamic experience. And it's been a friendly and supporting place.
Yeah, excellent. And I think that's what we want it to continue to grow to be. So thank you for your part in that. So just to begin, this chapter title is called The Transformation of Natural Theology, and the unlikely words that might get looked at is when we see the word transformation, at some level, science is by its very nature transformative. It is the changing of the mind about how we understand the world and our participation in it. So is there a unique sense that we should be reading into the word transformation of the title? And the word natural, we probably take for granted, but maybe we shouldn't. So the question of what is it that is implied by the word natural that has any really consistent meaning? Or is there some way that we should really be listening to the word natural to get a better grip of what it might be implying?
Oh, sure. Good question. So for transformation, I think that's an understatement because basically he's charging that, along with Barth, that traditional natural theology is a projection of creaturely experience and creaturely features onto God just in a greater degree of analogy. And so that kind of projection is mythology rather than theology, and it's not scientific in that the method is not appropriate to the subject matter. So how can one approach this discourse that goes by the name of natural theology? You've got to put a pretty strong qualifier in front of it to signal that what we need to do is turn it upside down, turn it on its head. And so knowledge of God comes from theology, not from the natural sciences. And so what we're seeking is an integrative vision where theology can be in dialogue with the natural sciences in a way that does justice both to the nature of theology and to the nature and cataphysin methods of all the different sciences. So, to me, it's the transformation of natural theology. That's an understatement of what is needed. And as far as the word natural goes, natural, according to Aristotle, using the word physis or physin, meant that which regularly occurs. And that became, the scope of physics, the study of physin, of regular phenomena, from the time of Aristotle on. Physics much broader than what we think of it today. But it had no capacity to deal with singularities that do not regularly occur. And so with the incarnation, a whole revolution in thought about what can be intelligible occurred. And so the doctrine of creation from nothing is a result of reflection on the incarnation, not a prelude to it. So we have the same kind of inversion there of incarnation and Trinity first, then our thinking about nature flows organically from that, rather than creation and the sciences first, and then our thinking about God flows naturally from that. So it's a complete reversal of the usual habits of thought in our culture, but it led not only to the doctrine of creation, including creation ex nihilo, and as Torrance says in this chapter, with that came the contingents of creation, meaning that it might have been otherwise. And therefore, we have to have empirical methods to investigate it, because God in his freedom could have made it differently than what we imagine it to be. And so we have to be prepared for surprises. Galileo thought the tides were due to the rotation of the Earth around its axis, compounded with the revolution of the Earth around the sun. And those two motions would never come into equilibrium, and that would explain the tides. And the Pope at the time, who was his friend, said, nope, you cannot join the authority of the church and of theologians to this view. You can't speak for the church, because God in his wisdom might have caused the tides through Kepler's theory that there's an invisible gravitational attraction between all the water on Earth and the moon and the sun. Or he might have even done it in some other way we haven't yet figured out. So don't claim to have demonstrated a theory of the tides on the basis of a priori reasoning, backed up by some experimental demonstrations or illustrations, but not demonstrations in the sense of proof.
Mm.
So that's just one example, but the idea that nature is contingent and that therefore it might be other than we expect it to be is at the very heart of an empirical approach to the natural sciences. And that really is a distant echo of Christian reflection on the ramifications of the incarnation. So if we start with the incarnation, we get the flourishing and a reinforcement of empirical methods in the natural sciences. Who would have thought it? But that's maybe a little beginning to the very good question, what does natural mean? Because when I teach survey courses in the history of science, which I do, we seek to look at two questions. What is nature and how is nature known? And we start with the ancient Babylonians and just ask those two questions of every place and time that we look at. What did they think was nature? And then following from that comes the answer, well, that's why they thought it should be known this way.
Right.
And there's no more profound answer than given by the church fathers that we ground our thinking on the incarnation, thinking about creation on the incarnation, not vice versa.
Very good. I just looked for some definitions, and one of them said the opposite of natural is artificial. And I
Yeah,
thought artificial can be just fake, but to say artificial means humanly made, and to say science at some level, by definition, is a human made thing. Michael Polanyi's personal knowledge. So to say all theology or all science is a human made investigation of the world, katafusen, but the humility piece is what I just heard you saying, that there has to be a humility by the church, a humility by the scientist to allow a proper investigation. So it's okay that it's artificial or an artifact of human investigation, but the proof part, that's where we become judges and we stand over theology at some level and don't allow the proper place to the investigative dimension, the humble investigation that needs to be there.
right. Let me just mention that our friend Brent Perkable, who many of
Yes.
you know, is a historian of technology as well as a historian of science. And we would argue that cataphysin methodologies are needed in technology and engineering as well. So we wouldn't want to establish a dualism between science and technology. And typically historians of science include technology, engineering, medicine, all the fields together.
So one question before we dive into your handout. Ray Anderson wrote an article on the question of natural theology or theology of nature. And does that move really help to view what it is that Torrance is doing, or does that not even quite grasp it?
Well, I read that some years ago, but I don't remember it, so I'd like to not comment on it. But I will say, and Elmer Collier also records a discussion with TF where he says TF conceded that maybe theology of nature might have been a better phrase. And I think theology of nature will really help the theologian in a way that's less misleading than the phrase natural theology. However, it's not of much help to the natural scientist as a natural scientist. And so what Torrance was doing, I think, goes beyond a theology of nature in that it was also inviting natural scientists as natural scientists to a dialogue where they would not have the ability to usurp the domain of theology any more than the theologian would do that to the scientist, but they would have a way of talking together that would be mutually beneficial. So I think we miss sight on that dialogue if we use the term theology of nature, because then we're theologians talking to theologians. What if there's one theologian in the room and the rest are natural scientists? I think the theologian has the ability, following Torrance, to say, look, there is a common conversation all of us can be involved in. So bring me to the table as a theologian, and you'll find I have things to say that will resonate with the very issues you are dealing with as a scientist in your field. Whether that's, all of those perspectives on science that the theologian can articulate will turn out to be helpful to the natural scientist in her day-to-day work, so that she can have a more holistic approach to the interdisciplinary aspects of her work. Let me put it this way. It's a cliche among American research universities that you hear all the time. All significant problems, research problems in the natural sciences are interdisciplinary. And so as institutions, places like the University of Oklahoma spend a lot of effort trying to figure out, how do we create interdisciplinary research teams? Because people who are trained to solve one problem in their discipline need to get together with other people who are trained to solve one kind of problem in their discipline. And they're going to have to work together to figure out how to work on problems that are really calling for the creation of a new discipline, where the methods will be disclosed as the research goes on, but are not identical to what we have now. So I think Torrance perceived that, and what he's proposing is this dialogue that can be more holistic and integrated. And in this sense, theology becomes the guardian of the integrity of sciences, not just its own integrity, but the integrity of other sciences as well.
And those universities you're referring to, would they ever invite a theologically minded person into those interdisciplinary discussions? And would something like that happen in the UK or one of those places that don't have the separation?
Yeah, ask me in a year. That's the really hard question. Is there enough space for that? I've had a number of conversations at a top level and with different results, but it's always been unofficial. But I think that it helps us to read certain parts of Torrance, like this chapter, with the idea that he's not engaged in trying to prove the Christian faith. He's trying to get a seat at the table for the Christian as Christian, where science and science policies and science research is being discussed. And that includes a way of legitimizing for the Christian who is a scientist to be open about their faith while they're doing their science. And that lives up to his title. That's transformative.
Yeah. And Torrance was recognized in the UK for his scientific achievements and invited to be part of I can't remember the name of what it was he was part of, but this book was written in 1980. Was he recognized after that point by the scientific community as being a valid member at the table?
He was already in those two societies that he mentions.
Royal Society, yep.
One philosophy of science and one, I can't remember, but yeah, he was already in those. And the first chapter, as you've already read, was his acceptance of the Templeton Prize, acknowledging work he had already done, especially theological science, in '69. So
Good.
yeah,
So
he
is
was
it writing this
already
book-
on. He was already on
modeling.
every radar screen. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's modeling what it is in a sense that he hoped could be kind of the course that we are taking.
Exactly. Let me actually say that that's part of his Scottish heritage as well. One of the ways that Scots of his generation used to contrast Scottish university culture with English university culture was to say that in Scotland, all the universities had the aim of listening to every scientific discipline, science broadly defined, to engage in a common discussion about the different methodologies involved. That means everybody, no matter what science they were a part of, they had a stake in understanding how other disciplines had different methodologies or similar, either way. And that common debate about methodologies varying across the sciences was what you were supposed to get out of, say, the junior level science for non-science majors course. We tend to just give a dumbed down version of the discipline, but the goal was not to teach someone to recite the right answers on a test, but to be able to reason on the foundations of the discipline. And there's nowhere maybe better to illustrate this than in mathematics. And if you want a demonstration of that, read The Democratic Intellect by George Davies, a book which Torrance loved and endorsed. I would say that in my own focus on the history of geology in Scotland, this is the way so many geologists write, expecting a general readership because of the methodological issues raised by the new geology. And it's something that I think is often overlooked in, for example, I have no proof of this, but I think it's part of the reason he wanted to stay in Edinburgh. It wasn't just that he was a Scot and Edinburgh was home. It's that there was this culture of interdisciplinary dialogue in Scotland that is incredibly hard to create. If research universities in America could create that, we would be better off. But even when we're trying to create it, they did it, and we still have so much to learn from. And I think he was speaking in that kind of intellectual culture. So he wasn't unaccustomed to sitting down at dinner and talking to the person next to him, regardless of what field or profession they were in.
And does that culture still exist today in Scotland?
That'd be a question for Bruce. I don't know.
I don't know if Bruce is able to talk to us or not, but
Yeah. Yeah. But if you haven't read it, the Democratic Intellect is I think it will help anyone understand Torrance's milieu very well.
Bruce, did you want to speak to that question?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, just to say, I don't think I'd be able to give any more insight into that in terms of the situation today. There are so many universities nowadays which are specialist universities. So that sort of militates against that sort of interdisciplinary starting point at the very beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All
Okay,
the pressures of modernity work against it. Even in the 19th century, Davies laments that the English universities teaching their young mathematics students are just teaching them how to be hacks and not to really understand the foundations of mathematics. But on the other hand, there were jobs to be had, and what the employers needed was people who could do the mathematics. They didn't need to hire people who could discourse on the foundations of mathematics. So, there was a real tension felt in the early 19th century over these same issues. Bruce?
So your subtitle for your handout is Reading the Ground and Grammar Theology as Gifford Lectures. I think that's tied into exactly what you're saying here. Could you say just a little bit for those who aren't familiar with the Giffords and why that is a meaningful statement?
Yeah, it is. So the Gifford Lectures are one of them. After Newton, the Boyle Lectures were founded in England to deploy the results of the new empirical sciences as natural theology, and most of the Boyle lecturers were doing the traditional form of natural theology of arguing from nature to God. The Bridgewater treatises in the 19th century are a second example of post-Newtonian natural theology. The Bridgewater treatises were all by leading scientific figures in early Victorian science. Some, but not all, have that traditional natural theology orientation. Others are just thinking of natural theology as an excuse to just express wonder at creation. And that's a kind of a lowest common denominator unifier of public interest in science. But for Scotland, the Gifford Lectures are, I think, even more important than those two really well-known exemplars of what natural theology means. And the Gifford Lectures began with a bequest in the late 19th century by Lord Gifford, and they take place in is it 4 Scottish universities: Aberdeen,
universities,
Edinburgh,
yep.
Glasgow, and St. Andrews.
Yep.
And they alternate, and a typical speaker would come for 1 or usually 2 years. The lectures might be from a dozen to as many as 50. It's expected that they would be published as a book afterwards. And I'll tell you, I'd love to have any graduate student study the Gifford Lectures as a background for Torrance, because I believe the more we know about the Gifford Lectures, the more we're going to be able to contextualize what Torrance is saying. He tends, in my opinion, to be charitable. He doesn't call out names every time he's disagreeing with somebody. And I think he's having a running critique of specific Gifford lecturers throughout Ground and Grammar and other books as well, but especially here. So, for example, this first section on traditional natural theology, I think it's a brilliant, racy, or succinct summary of traditional natural theology, but I think it's shaped very much by his pointed reminders to people who knew specific lectures, like James Barr and Brand Blanchard were Gifford lecturers. And I think, I mean, when he's talking about critics of Barth misunderstanding Barth and because they're trapped in their own dualism, there you go. He's got specific people in mind. And so, in my opinion, it is a tragedy that he was never asked to give the Gifford Lectures, or we might have a more patient, comprehensive, systematic presentation of his thinking on science and faith. But what we have here is his attempt, in my opinion, to enter into that stream of discourse and to try to correct it and then divert it to a different direction that, in my opinion, would be better called the historical discussion of the topic of the unity and the relations of the sciences. And if we approached it with that in mind, this interdisciplinary dialogue, rather than natural theology, then we'd understand more of what he's trying to do within that particular Scottish tradition.
I should say too, the Gifford Lectures, both Michael Polanyi and John McMurray are those who he looked to in those lectures.
Yeah.
Personal knowledge and the self as agent, a person's relation, were a contribution to Torrance's work. So it was a dialogue partner in both positive and negative directions there. So which it just furthers the importance, as you're saying, of engaging that as a backdrop, the theater
Boy,
within which the conversation's happening.
isn't the world better because we have personal knowledge and the self as agent, the books they wrote, and another one by McMurray. If only we had a true Gifford lecture from Torrance. The scope for natural theology in the quote, this natural theology discourse was pretty broad. So when they invited Etienne Gilson to do the book that is the spirit of medieval philosophy, and boy, you want a presentation of faith and reason that is that ladder idea, go there, or any of Gilson's works, like Faith and Reason in the Middle Ages or something like that, a short little book. It's that ladder traditional natural theology exemplified. So grapple with Gilson, and then realize that to counter that, they invited Barth to come kind of swing in what they thought was the opposite direction. But at least they're giving a broader scope to the lectures, not speaking in a single voice.
Right.
And I think that it's reasonable to have supposed that, if things might have gone differently, it'd be a good question for this dissertation someone needs to write. What were the reasons that Torrance wasn't invited to give the Gifford lectures? And I bet they're more political than otherwise.
Yeah.
But he really should have been.
Yeah, it's a good question. And somebody may know the answer to that. And the question, why has Kerry Magruder not been invited to give a Gifford lecture? Is
Oh,
another important question.
yeah, right. Because I'm too busy doing administrative duties to publish much. So,
You wouldn't take the Gifford lectures if it was offered to you?
um, thankfully, I don't have to engage in that hypothetical.
We shall see. We shall see. So you have a prologue. You have a brief discussion of the prologue, which just sets the course of really understanding the nature of the relation between theology and nature at some level. Is there any comments in the prologue that helps guide the conversation that you wanted to point out?
No, I don't want to linger on the prologue. I think it's part recap of where he's been in the previous chapters, and then just helping us remember that the theologian cannot be isolated from the universe.
Yes.
Theology has a special role in speaking to the other sciences, and
Yeah.
theologians need to have the alertness to step into that role in certain occasions.
The word interrelated that's in your prologue, and it'll be there throughout the book, that I tend to use in the social sciences the word contextualized, that you can't integrate psychology and theological therapy because the assumption of psychology is the individual, and theology, as I know it, assumes the onto-relational being. And therefore, you can contextualize contemporary psychology as a science to talk about the phenomenon of dysfunction and all that within a theological thinking, but the foundation has to be the theological understanding of the person to be able to then do the contextual work. So do you have a sense on the nature? I can hear the people sitting at the table in science, and you don't want to say, we're going to contextualize you within us so that there could be some problems sitting at the table. But what is your
Yeah,
thought on the language
yeah.
of contextualizing versus interrelated?
Marty, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it because integration really could be misunderstood and misapplied in a scientistic kind of hegemony of one discipline asserting itself inside another. It would be illegitimate. So the important thing is to go back and look at the history of the term, and the proximal use of integration is Michael Polanyi. And so Polanyi's ideas about the stratification of the sciences and integration are essential here, but it's actually older than that. You can find it, for example, in Torrance's teacher, Daniel Lamont, in Christ in the World of Thought. He opens that book, as I recall, with a beautiful quotation about the need of having specialists of integration, not just specialists of particular sciences. And if it's not in the opening page, it's later on in the book. But the term is used by Lamont. It predates Polanyi. He was picking up a usage that was maybe more clear in his day than now. Now the word integration means that you just kind of conglomerate without distinction. And maybe we need something like the definition of Chalcedon to help us here.
So when
Uh,
you think integration, what is your short definition of it? Not a conglomeration. What?
um, it's a holistic coordination across disciplinary subject areas that respects each level of order, but that very coordination provides um, a greater coherence. Um, the term actually, not the term, but the idea, it arises in a tradition of discussion of the posterior analytics. And I encourage everybody, if, great bedtime reading. Next time you want to pick up a mystery novel, go to your shelf, get your works of Aristotle out, and read the posterior analytics. I've read, well, there are many hundreds, maybe 1,000 commentaries on posterior analytics just before all that got disseminated in all the other disciplines in the early modern period. I've read at least 30 from the Middle Ages, okay? But the posterior analytics is where Aristotle is talking about vertical relations between sciences. And he had a big beef with Plato for making illegitimate inferences that ignored the integrity of different sciences. And yet the sciences must be in dialogue, Aristotle insisted. So how do we find out, how do we determine what the best proper form of dialogue is that will respect the integrity of the disciplines and allow them to speak to each other, but in a way that is mutually beneficial?
Mm.
And for example, one of his illustrations, which is repeated all the way into the 20th century in such discussions, is the physician knows that round wounds heal more slowly than just straight wounds, all other factors being equal. Now that's a principle that they have learned from geometry, but they've brought it into medicine. So how do we determine when bringing principles from one field into another is appropriate, and when is it a violation of disciplinary integrity? And he had a word for that particular error, and in Latin it's called metabasis. And Torrance actually uses the word metabasis. So he's familiar with this intellectual tradition. I'll bet you he could come close to reciting some of those passages from Aristotle. It wouldn't surprise
Probably
me a
could.
bit.
Yes. Good. So looking at section 1, traditional natural theology, at some level, traditional here is, I think of C.S. Lewis's statement that sometimes the best way to make progress is to recognize you're on the wrong road and to go back where you started
Yeah,
and get on the right road.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so from page 76 to 87, at some level, is okay, here's where we got off the road. Is that a fair kind
yeah,
of,
yeah,
yeah? So
absolutely.
walk
It is
us.
so easy to get off the road because, especially for those who love nature and spend a lot of time in nature or in the sciences, we want to bring this joy that we have and this knowledge we have into alignment with our faith. And what can we bring? We want to bring more than, just pound our drum, says the little drummer boy.
Mhm.
Um, what, but there's the ancient metaphor of the two books that speak in harmony, and the book of God's word and the book of God's works. And the temptation is always for people who are spending their whole lives, day after day, reading the book of God's works, to say, here I've discovered the key to God's word.
Mm.
And that's the impulse behind this traditional natural theology.
Right.
But on the other hand, we don't want to say there's no harmony between them. So how do we find a way of reading across the two books? That's what the word integration is trying to capture. And it's not done on some simple level. It has to be done recognizing the books are likely in different languages. We can't just simply juxtapose them. We've got to do some hard thinking and developing perspectives that do justice to both sides, but not just to the book of God's words, but to theology, that is the science that interprets that, and not just to natural phenomena, but to the natural sciences, which interpret that. We set those in relation somehow higher up, and how do we do that in a way that respects both? So,
So
so
the road taken that traditional theology went is basically a road of dualism, which you could say
right,
is disintegration. I mean, if integration is the model that you're going to be holding out, this was the road of disintegration.
right,
And there were signs for two hotels. One of them said, "We have really good ideas for you here." And the other said, "This will feel like the most real place you've ever touched or felt or whatever." It's the experiential of the physical in a sense. And some people love the good ideas, and some people like the idea of kind of touching reality without recognizing that you either check into one hotel or the other and you've lost something, right?
yeah,
And so the work of trying to bridge them, to build that bridge to bring together those two elements, that is in a sense the attempt that we're trying to get at here. Because at some level, both of them are reality in a sense, insofar as in a Polanyi kind of way, the nature of we know the other, we reflect on the other. Yes, it's our knowledge, but it's a knowledge that's truly informed by the other. So the bridge is the connecting of our thinking with reality so that it becomes integrated.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that thinking has to be held together with the lower doxological level of our experience where there's worship. Let me just say that two books metaphor goes back at least to Psalm 19. And you may all remember that psalm that begins with the first half of the psalm is a worshiping God because of the order of the heavens. So it's just exalting in the order of the heavens. And then the second half of the psalm is a similar exalting in the giving of the law and the fact that God's word has been given, that God has spoken through both. But there's this, so there's the language of God speaking is present with both, but with the order of the heavens, there's this perplexing line that's hard to translate in the second or third verse, that their language has gone out through all the world, but without speech or words. But nevertheless, it's gone out. So that's the clue that these can be united in our experience, but nevertheless, uniting them in our thinking is going to be a little bit more complex because they're not speaking in the same way. And so we have to turn to the book of God's word to figure out how to really do the relation between them.
Yeah. And then the beginning of Romans, the self-evidence that it was self-evident to them is building on the human perception and the sense of the validity of there being this, right? It's right there. They should know it. That also is a kind of a scientific observation and an immediate kind of awareness without theological input necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So there are problematic stepping stones all over the Bible that need to be seen in a broader context. The Torrances would generally say, that's just showing the problem. The answer is nobody got it. Everyone has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Everybody was blind, and therefore God had to show up in the person of Jesus to become the science of God, the revelation of the knowing. So God is, in a sense, the one who informs our scientific exploration as theologians and goes on from there. But not everyone connects chapter 1 and chapter 3 in that kind of way. But that's a helpful way to go. So as you proceed here then through traditional natural theology, you talk about the nature of the bridges with the cosmological and the epistemological dualism. Could you just clarify what those mean for us?
Sure. And in the first 3 pages of the handout, I'm just trying to outline exactly what Torrance is saying. But I used a few slides to illustrate it. So, for example, the dualism cosmologically is illustrated on that page of slides with Aristotelian dualism and Newtonian dualism, showing with Aristotle that there's a complete break between what the moon and above the moon has a whole different set of laws in physics than everything beneath the moon. Beneath the moon is the only place in the entire universe there's death and corruption and change in a confused manner. And so you have to have a completely different physics of the earth than a physics of the heavens. And Philoponus would have nothing to do with that. And the picture there is of a top because following Basil, the great theologian, he's using the picture of the top as the continuing efficacy of God's creative command throughout the whole universe. So the same kind of laws are going to explain the physics of the earth like a top and the physics of the planets and the order of the heavens. So there's an integration of heavens and earth in Philoponus's anti-Aristotelian cosmos. with Newton, it's something similar. The space and time are absolute, which has no connection at all with the way we experience space and time. And Einstein, his unification of space and time um, together was a dissolution of that cosmological dualism. So dualism isn't one thing, it's one type of thing. It can have many manifestations, but in this case, what's common is that the dualism provided a chasm that prevented us from thinking about God. It was already imposing this separation for things that ought to start off being closely together and intertwined. And so I hope those illustrations help.
Yeah, just a point of clarification for me. When I think of Plato, I think of reality as the realm of the form. So it's in the ideas. And with Aristotle, he said, no, it's in the particulars of the world. He rejected kind of the idea thing in the particulars of the world, the argument based on what is present and real. So those two almost represent the dualism themselves, one completely in the mind and the other completely in the world, and the
The School of
categorization.
Athens, each pointing to what's real in
Right.
Raphael's school.
Is that a fair statement to say that in those two Greek philosophers we have an embodied sense of the dualism?
Yeah, I think Aristotle is has it nuanced a lot more in that and so his dualism is worked out differently, but yes, he believes that particular things are real, and yet to understand them we still have the same kind of matter and form dualism that we have to relate through abstractions, but we always have to keep going back to the particular being that's real. The key point with Aristotle, I'd go back to that definition of phusis being that which regularly happens. This particular dog is real, but the dog that endures isn't just a mental form like Plato, but it's the cycle of generations. There are always dogs like this. And so the reality is that this is a world that has dogs. And so there is that tension between the particular and the universal in Aristotle, and our understanding cannot grasp the particular. Our understanding can only grasp the universal, that which is regular, not that which is particular. Not even the prime mover, the unmoved mover, can grasp the particular to Aristotle. So yeah, but I love the School of Athens by Raphael. I always start off with that. Each is pointing to what they think is real. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, you're on page 3, when you begin at the top of the 3 phases, you have phase 1 is Neoplatonic. So again, building on Platonic, Byzantine, and then Augustinian, Aristotelian. So you've got these developments on these philosophers
And
in the development,
and
then
these
moving
are
beyond
TF. Yeah, this is TF. And I think it's a
Yeah.
brilliant summary of this complex intellectual history. And it's also a running critique of particular advocates of these things in the Gifford lectures.
And so to what degree would you say the Neoplatonic Byzantine is focusing on the world of the ideas of the natural, and the Augustinian, which we haven't talked about the role of, I mean, Augustine shows up in 2 of the 3 here, and we haven't really said what is Augustine's contribution to this worldview or way of thinking about theology and science that contributes to these malleability within Aristotelian and Newtonian thought.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'll open that up. If anyone else has a succinct way of putting that, please volunteer. The way the reason and faith dualism is often expressed is nature and grace, that they become separated in a way that then it creates the problem of how to relate them again. And maybe Well, the facing page, those top slides I used as a way of trying to get through this relatively quickly,
Yeah.
intuitively. With Rembrandt, I think you see an integration of nature and grace. They're not separated. And so you can see Christ at the tomb, um, and he's risen, and the whole poignant scene is portrayed with great meaning, but it's not the way a mere photograph would capture it.
Yeah.
And so that's an integration of nature and grace, whereas in the Augustinian and even the Neoplatonic Byzantine, grace is separated from nature in a reduction upwards, which I think is a wonderful phrase of TF's.
Yeah.
So that we have to leave nature behind in seeking the realm of grace.
Mm-hmm.
And grace supersedes nature in terms of where there is meaning. And in that world, it's hard to justify, for example, one of my friends who is devoted to the algae that live in the river that is the border between Texas and Oklahoma.
Mm.
But how could a Christian devote herself to river algae? I mean, really? So, well, there's a problem there. I think
That's an interesting
Rembrandt could come closer to understanding that. Or the opposite, reduction downwards is where nature is devouring grace and there's no room left for grace. So, and the picture of Edward Manet there, where he takes the typical goddess feminine form and just puts her in uh, an outrageous, notorious setting in a breakfast picnic outdoors. That's the death of all that goddesses and allegorical, iconic elements in painting ever symbolized. It's a closing up of the heavens in a realistic world, so-called, where there's no, or as Charles Taylor would say, there's no more any porous exposure to the transcendent.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of dynamic of dualism, the reduction upwards or the reduction downwards, I think is really, really helpful. And maybe thinking about it in terms of nature and grace can help. To relate that to Newton, Newton was a theologian. I mean, if you say I'm a theologian, then definitely Newton was. One of my favorite books on Newton, if you are curious, is The Janus Faces of Genius by Betty Jo Teeter Dobbs. And she argues, and I think she's right on, she's a lifelong Newton scholar, or was, is that theological concerns were at the heart of his entire work, and everything he did in natural science or elsewhere was an attempt to find that which would mediate between nature and grace. Having lost the belief in the mediator, the incarnation of Jesus Christ, what could perform that mediating function? And sometimes it was gravity, understood as this kind of pantheistic force, or the direct finger of God, both immanent and transcendent. Sometimes it was alchemical forces. Sometimes it was this, that, or the other. But everything he did was really the lifelong quest for a mediator that, so he was honest in saying, confessing that he had not found what he was looking for as a result of despite all of his discoveries.
And he couldn't see the mediator in Christ.
Right.
So the phrase nothing buttery, the nature of the reduction upwards, there's nothing but the realm of the spiritual, nothing but grace. And the other, there's nothing but the material, the physical, and the heavens are shut out. Nothing but.
Yeah. So this dynamic would arise in our own individual lives and all the dualistic temptations that assail us in our own culture. Yeah. Anytime.
Yeah. So then on page 4, you move on to some of the later voices, pages 85 to 87, with Kant, Comte, Mach, and Lessing.
I don't have those there just because they're the most important, but rather as illustrative of Torrance's claim, which he didn't elaborate on, that there was a collapse of these forms of natural theology. And he lists Humean skepticism, the Kantian critique, and the positivism of the Vienna Circle, which an early positivism is Comte and the later one is Mach. So these were just meant to illustrate
Yeah.
the dualism that is really getting to links that are tragic in
Yeah.
their impact on different fields, and and uh, and then he claims rightly, I mean, so rightly, I think you could say that he's analyzing the trajectory of the Gifford lectures here, that the early Gifford lectures were dealing with these critiques that he just mentioned and trying to hold on to natural theology, but losing it. And then others gave up on it and took the turn that he says, turn to moral or even existential approaches to natural theology to bridge the chasm. And I think that's a good summary of the trajectory of the Gifford lectures through the first half of the 20th century.
Which then you list the Gifford lectures below those images.
And yeah, he points out that Eric Maskell's book, The Openness of Being, was one that really shouldn't be lumped in with all the others. He's really trying to overcome dualism in that, and that's a wonderful book, and I'm sure it influenced Torrance. He cites it in many of his works, and I found it helpful myself. But I just pulled out others just to illustrate that Gifford lectures aren't all the standard 5 ways to God on the approach of Aquinas.
Right. The old traditional, the road that should not have been taken.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. So there's a wide while the Gifford lectures have this predominant cast of mind that is the traditional natural theology of some point, there is a dialogue. And I'm reminded of Alistair, where is it? Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue, where in that book he argues that the word tradition should not be avoided. What we need are criteria for healthy traditions, and a healthy tradition is one that is always involved in a rigorous discussion of the nature of the tradition. That if that ever ossifies and gets unquestioned, the tradition is no longer healthy.
Yeah.
And put that right in the context of, he's speaking of the Gifford lectures. I think it's a perfect Gifford lecture. Look, this whole discourse of natural theology needs to have this invigorating debate over what we are about.
Yeah.
And that the old natural theology just proved to be a dead end. And as perennial as the temptation is to slide into it, we need to be having this debate about science and faith that is broader than the traditional natural theology.
And that it's, in a sense, it's Michael Polanyi's term, a society of explorers is the nature of that community who are in that corrective position to one another. And the final phrase of personal knowledge. And this is how I understand Christians stand in worship before God. And that is that openness to the conversation as Christians, that is the scientific endeavor for conversation discovery as persons in community. So high resonance there that also Torrance, of course, picks up in a number of places. So moving on to the second section of the book, which is Karl Barth's critique of traditional natural theology, pages 87 to 93. The question of, just how well Barth was understood is always a big question, because he does get misunderstood quite often. The nature of the way that Torrance feels that he has some things that are right, but he also feels that there are some things to correct in him. So just give us a quick statement on what is it about Barth that he likes and what is it he'd like to change?
Well, I read this section as him endorsing Barth. And granted, he's perfectly capable of saying that and then differing silently. He does that with all sorts of people. He praises and then tweaks them. But up through page 93, I think he's doing his best to present Barth and to agree with Barth. And he's presenting the critique of natural theology on the basis of both theological and scientific grounds. And so I did the color coding. I hope that helps
Yeah.
to unpack that quote. Barth's real objection to traditional natural theology rested on theological and scientific grounds. Oh, and by the way, he really is correcting Gifford lecturers who accused Barth of being a dualist of all things. Ah, so that's why he said, no, look, Barth was actually had some contemporary targets that he was that had misunderstood this mythological element of projecting creaturely capacities into our theology that are just going to lead to a denial of the faith eventually. So anyway, he is defending Barth from critics who did not understand Barth because they didn't grasp his theological objection and his scientific objection.
Yeah.
And his theological objection is, look, if we don't have the Trinity, we don't have an accurate understanding of God. And natural theology just proceeds on an entirely different basis. And scientifically, they don't have the cataphysin method.
Yeah.
And Barth, with that disagreement with Schultz in the first pages of the Church Dogmatics, is insisting on the invalidity of a universal scientific method to be applied to all areas of knowledge. Not even the natural sciences do that. So Barth's scientific objection is actually protecting the integrity of every science, as I mentioned earlier, by defending this cataphysin approach. You can't import or you can't export your own methodology for another discipline. That's contrary to the cataphysin.
Bruce has written a comment in the comments. In, I think, the very first lecture TFT gave to us as students, he emphasized that creation out of nothing made any argument for God from nature absolutely impossible. Having set out that position, TFT then tried to create an appropriate connection between science and theology in terms of non-Newtonian ways of thinking.
Oh, that's so well said. Exactly. The creation from nothing makes the creation contingent, which means it might have been otherwise, which means there's no logical bridge that can go from creation to God. Period. Natural theology got a dart to the heart. It's impossible. It's inconceivable to a Christian. So if we hold to the incarnation and Trinity, to that confession, then the impulse behind natural theology is a non-starter on both theological and scientific grounds. And the point I was just making is that other sciences should rejoice at this, because this is the cost of being able to defend any science.
Yeah. He wants that kind of responsibility.
Yeah, as soon as we admit theology to the table and say theology can have its own cataphysin method, then with that very small down payment, we get the cataphysin methodology applied to every science that protects every field of science and helps strengthen it as a discipline, helps every field of science figure out what is appropriate to that science and what's not. So the sciences flourish when theology is given a seat at the table with this cataphysin definition of scientific.
Yeah. And Barth did begin the church dogmatics. Christian dogmatics is the church's scientific self-examination of its distinctive talk about God. So it was clearly a scientific rigor that he wanted to bring to the task of understanding God. And then when you get to volume 3, the doctrine of creation, to see in the light of that and not discount the sciences. It's not my field. I'm not saying that they don't have a place, but we have to establish the nature of who is the God who creates before we can talk about that which is created. So there is an ordering in his scientific investigation that also seems to be important. And I think it's Polanyi who says the church has the problem of setting up these authorities like the Pope and other things that become authorities instead of the community becoming the authority that does exactly what you were describing just a few moments ago, that the scientific rigor is by the community doing the work of engaging reality, correcting one another, and aligning katafusen.
Oh, exactly. So take the community and then also add over a history. Read After Virtue, for example, the book we mentioned earlier, that a tradition of debate is going to work out this cataphysin method in community. So the church is the essential arena for theology. And this is the answer to Travis's question. You describe allowing theology to be a science to be a small down payment. What might you say to those who argue that this opens the floodgates to include things like astrology and voodoo as sciences? And what I would say is it's going to be a historical question. So as a historian of science, I think it's absurd to claim that the Babylonians did not develop mathematical astronomy, but they did so with astrology and forms of voodoo. But over time, and not until really the 18th and 19th centuries, did astronomy succeed in realizing that astrological methods were not cataphysin to the discipline of astronomy. But even Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo himself, all three of those cast horoscopes. There was no way to distinguish between astronomy and astrology in those stages of development. So there really is a historical refining of any science that takes place in the community of practitioners of that science. And this is why theology, given a seat at the table, articulating the cataphysin methodology, has something to contribute to encourage any practitioners in a field of science to be more disciplined with the cataphysin methodology in their own field over time. So does that help, Travis?
That's largely similar to how I might approach it as well. My experience has been people use astrology and voodoo as a hand wave to say, look, only an idiot would affirm this, so you must be like that. And I find that actually looking at the history is more complicated than that.
Yeah, boy, the history is so complicated. So there are unresolved questions right now in the field of the history of science about exactly when and how astrology fell out of astronomy. There's no consensus among professional historians of science yet on this question, and because it's complicated. But it did happen as a process of the community of scientists blindly groping and then coming on to more and more purely cataphysin methods. And I would say that this relativizes objections to the Trinity based on the controversies leading up to the Council of Nicaea. We find that kind of confusion and faltering steps and eventually resolution of issues. That's true of every science. That's just part of how the self-purification of a science works as members of the community apply the cataphysin standard and try to proceed. Torrance himself points out that the church fathers took the phrase cataphysin from physicians in the Roman era who were trying to make similar moves in the field of medicine and anatomy and physiology. And and say, no, we've got to go back to more rigorous methods and start fresh in a way.
At the last Karl Barth conference on Barth and politics, the question was, what was Barth's contribution or influence to politics? Though that question kind of was never asked. And virtually every one of the speakers, with maybe a few parts of some of them, was saying Barth got it wrong on natural theology. He was reading in culture, he was reading in male dominance and all this. And it just came to me that for Barth, the natural theology, his address is to write out prejudices that are read in by pre-thinking and judging what must be true and right and real. And he wanted to allow God to be the one who defined the nature of what is true and right and real. And what filled in the place was all these political subsets of people who were for different minorities, whether it's racial or gender issues, and what they saw as a more proper theology. And it was all just a natural theology of what makes sense to me. And so when you set Barth aside, your theology or politics, it really falls into the exact trap that you're talking about there. And to just see how, even a bunch of Barth scholars in the room can't see the advance that Barth made, stand with Barth, and to be able to critique those kind of things. Though in the end, with tragic outcomes, in a sense, George Hunsinger did try to say something, was shut down and walked out of the room, which just shows that, that's where sometimes the table ends up with not conversing. So that's a conversation where what we're talking about here is really a vital step into the right direction to make those kind of connections, to be able to have respect and honoring of the opinions, but to go forward in ways that are helpful. So it's still pertinent. It's part of what I'm saying. These things, understanding Barth and understanding where we go from there, are still pertinent kinds of questions. So at the bottom of page 5, you have mention of Athanasius. So Athanasius, of course, is a favorite. How is it that Torrance is using Athanasius to build an understanding of scientific understanding? We don't think of Athanasius as the scientist. So,
is there any book that Torrance wrote that doesn't refer to Athanasius?
that's a good question.
So I do love this quote, and here I've cited the Trinitarian faith, where Athanasius said it would be more godly or devout and true or accurate to signify God from the Son and call him Father than to name God from his works alone and call him unoriginate or creator. And so in the column to the left, I've just tried to outline what's involved there to help make the logic clear of this claim that the idea that God is Father is arrived at through a cataphysin process, because the Son is an intrinsic relation of the Trinity, but the created works is an extrinsic relation with the Trinity. So that is not scientific. It's not to know him through the creation, but not through the Son. It's mythology, not theology, not science, not cataphysin. So,
Dwayne,
it would revolutionize most Christians' approach to apologetics if we could we really come to agreement that God as creator is best known, scientifically known, in light of God as Father, not vice versa. But so often the temptation is, let's try to convince people of a creator, and then maybe our friend, a theologian, can come in and lead them the last, quarter mile to believe in God. That just doesn't work,
Yeah.
Yeah, Kerry, just an observation here. That's where the doctrine of the person and theological anthropology comes in, because if we don't understand our place, that we are made to be this way, to give voice to the unintelligible creation, if you don't understand your relationship correspondence analogously to the father-son relationship, you can't understand what the meaning of creation is. So how can you define it and then define the proper rules to go cataphusin?
Well put, Dwayne. Appreciate that. And let me just say that idea of the priest of creation that you've mentioned, that the title of the first chapter of this book. Several places in this book, I know Torrance brings that up, and in more than a dozen of his books, he mentions, nature is dumb or mute, and it's up to us to give it voice. And rather than interpreting that in light of natural theology, interpret that in light of Psalm 19 and that verse that I quoted earlier. Torrance knew the two books metaphor, and the fact that the book of God's works is not written in words according to Psalm 19. But yet, as a Christian, we are to hold them together. I think that's where that's the basis for that metaphor of nature is mute, and we give it voice, comes from. It's a way of saying, when we've got the two books, let's keep the book of God's works in its place. We don't go from the book of God's works to God, because the book of God's works speaks, but not in words, according to Psalm 19. So
This
So
would be
every time
exactly
you
the
come across that,
theology
yeah,
the theology of nature, in a sense, would be saying, if we begin with the creator and then investigate the world and even the algae in the river that divides Oklahoma from Texas,
yeah,
that you, at some level, you've acknowledged a God who's created even these, seemingly unimportant things, and yet gives dignity and value and worth as the glory of God goes out and we study all that God's made. I mean, there is a honoring and valuing to all of the investigation that one does then.
and we're going to have to do all that, and we're going to have to do the hard work in any field, especially theology, but every field, to work through the principles of that field to come up with the perspectives that are actually going to be relating to the other fields. So,
Right.
so
So on page 6, you then move on, and you've got a picture of Karl Barth there with a box model of science. And the nature, just to understand, the box represents what? Is
I
it
hope
the
I hope you all find this helpful. I do. The arrows represent the way you can define a box in geometry. Okay. But here the allegory is that those arrows symbolize what we might call the infrastructure of a science. And that would be the first principles and how they're worked out. And the surface of the box would be the perspective. So that process I was just saying, it's not just obvious, but we've got to put work and real thought and care into thinking through what the perspectives are that are consistent with our science. So the sides of the box are those perspectives. So I hope that would help. And so a box like this is an emblem of the unity of a science. And as far as we can get cataphysin moving out along the path of these arrows, that's the science. And if we can't get cataphysin any farther, we don't go there. The unity of the science is determined by the reach of the cataphysin methods working out in the directions of these arrows.
So for Karl Barth, all science is done through the person of Christ. Is Christ at the center of those errors, or is he the perimeter encompassing all of it, and the human community of the church as a scientific community is at the center? How do you see that?
The incarnation and Trinity are the very center.
Okay.
And everything else is coming out from that.
Okay.
The ground and grammar of the science. Yeah.
Right. And there's a question related to that I'll get to later, but just to say it, I think that Torrance said that Barth had a single box and he held two boxes, right?
Yeah.
So that's going to come on.
Yeah,
And so,
to me, that helps to illustrate in my thinking what Torrance is doing. He's crediting Barth for focusing on what makes the unity of a science, guarding theology from the incursion of methods appropriate for other sciences. Nope, you've got your own box. We are working in this box. Don't interfere. So theology, including a theology of nature, is going to be developed in this box, cataphysin. That's the unity of a science. But where Torrance is going to go farther is not disagreeing with this, but just returning to the problem that Barth could not take up for reasons of space and interest, and where Barth was teaching, he was a professor of theology in greater isolation from other fields than
Yeah.
Torrance was in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
So Torrance lives in a discussion where there are multiple boxes. And so the question then becomes, keeping the unity of each box intact, how do we appropriately relate these boxes? And in my opinion, Torrance has such confidence in what he often calls the unitary rationality of the universe, that surfaces of boxes are going to end up being close enough that there can be conversation across them between different fields. And so let's just use the word perspective for that. But there'll be resonance historically and a posteriori. You can't predict this, but it will just happen that, so these aren't, quote, metaphysical perspectives generated by the field of metaphysics before there's any investigation ever done. It's not that. He's saying there's as a result of the work in all the sciences, scientists working in some blue box over there are going to be dealing with issues that give them perspectives that then ask questions where we realize in theology, in the yellow box, we've got something to say about that. And so we can draw closer and begin to have a conversation. And if the two boxes are one and the same, if the person is a Christian, can actually close the gap and think about them actually from both sides, from both the blue box and from the yellow box. But they're cataphysin from both.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering if there isn't a way where there isn't kind of a wall between them, but they are two dimensions of the same space. And I'm just thinking of Maxwell recognizing the nature of fields by virtue of his theological thinking. He also recognized it within the physicality of electromagnetic fields, where one wasn't sitting next to the other. They were integrated in one reality. It's still one box, but it's.
I would wonder, I'd love to ask Torrance, the old discussions of the unity and relations of the sciences would often propose, well, what is the science of the blessed who actually have perfect knowledge and are fully reconciled?
Yeah.
We've got our science, but what would the science of the blessed be? Or we could say of the new creation. What's the science? And in that, we might say we will achieve an onto-relational understanding of the disciplines, where the glory of theology, in my opinion, and I think Torrance is explicit about this in Theological Science, chapter 6, is that theology will prove itself to have an interface, a connecting surface for every other field of science. Now that's a heuristic. Can theology do that?
Yeah.
We have to work it out in practice, but that's the promise and the challenge to theologians. Can we, as theologians, be the handmaid of all in that sense, in coming to serve every discipline by confirming the perspectives they're drawing out that, yes, we can say, yes, that's it.
Yeah.
I've told you on a previous reading group appearance before, I think, of my encounter with David Oldroyd, who's passed away now, but was one of his generation's greatest, most distinguished historians of geology. And he's one of those who's devoted his career to searching out how it was that the Earth became understood to have an interesting history. So the distinction between what we might call a developmental duration of the Earth, where there's change going on, but it's predetermined, it's a developmental kind of change. That is one thing, but a truly contingent history, that's another thing. How did it become accepted that the Earth has a contingent history? he spent so much work in that area. And for that reason, I became very interested in his work, and we got to know each other. And he's visited Norman many times, and I've met with him many times at conferences in other countries. And he was also just kind of a pugnacious personality. Maybe like Torrance, he's Australian, maybe like a lot of Australians, or a stereotype anyway. And a kinder, gentler form of the new atheist. But he certainly didn't have any hesitation in ribbing people for echoes of faith that he might detect in them. But curiously, he laid off of that on me for a long time. And then finally, we were eating lunch somewhere. And he looked at me and he put his hands together, and twinkle in his eye, and I knew it was coming. And he said, "Kerry, if I were to become a Christian, how would that make me a better geologist?" And I'm sure he was expecting an argument from design, some form of natural theology, maybe a fine-tuning argument, whatever it might be. And I told him this, just what we're talking about, that the theology of the incarnation sanctifies singular events. You can't be a Christian and say singular events don't matter. You have devoted your life to discerning and defending a contingent view of Earth history, while others want to resolve those contingencies away into necessary patterns. Christian theology will help you stand your ground and defend a contingent history of the earth. There you go.
Great. That's great.
Now, that's not an argument for God in the sense of proof, but that's a historical resonance where these two boxes are getting close enough to talk across the gap, and where the box of theology has something to offer the box of this geologist and historian of geology that he can see as relevant to his own cataphysis and investigations in his own field. So
He still had a
that,
twinkle in his eye.
to me, that conversation is exactly what Torrance was wanting to promote and had in mind with his so-called transformed natural theology.
Yeah, good. Dwayne, I see that hand up.
Dwayne?
Yeah, actually, Kerry, I just want to ask you, where do you think the word co-inhere works in this experience? Because it just comes to mind, again, getting back to the anthropology, us and him and us. Because John McKenna always used to, like, that was his thing. He was working with the Word made flesh and the logos. And like I sent you that outline of his last work that he wanted to do, this interface, because that's another. And then what's his name? He picks it up too, like, because there's that space there, but it's the mediation of Christ at every level as the true human who knows the meaning of everything and allowed it to be the way that it is, contingent, and yet it's no threat to his being, but it's causes chaos in our lives. Like, where do you see that as part of something that makes us as Christian investigators different?
I love that question, and coherence is a great word. And let me just say that Marty's question earlier about what integration means. I think if we had perfect integration from theology all the way down across the sciences, then we would be able to say there's coherence of we would have a holistic grasp of the whole reality, so that the perspectives of each science are co-inhering while also not doing damage to each science. They're co-inhering in a way that is appropriate for each level. Now, there's a new version of the handout online that was put up just a half an hour before I signed on. There'll probably be another one next week. I won't have time. Rest assured, you can be happy. I won't have time to work on it tomorrow or the next day, but maybe Monday or Tuesday. But what's added is a picture, a little diagram that to me illustrates a quotation from Space-Time and Resurrection that's in this handout, where to me, Space-Time and Resurrection is one of the best books to read on Torrance's natural theology. What he means by what we're talking about. You can get it all from Space-Time and Resurrection. And in there, he's taught, it's one of his clearest discussions of the way different sciences are stratified. And then he says, the resurrection of Jesus is a new level at the top of all of these disciplinary relations. And so I've drawn a yellow arrow going down from the resurrection, transforming first theology and then all the others all the way down. It's with an integration of the resurrection in let's say the science of the blessed, in the new creation, we will have a co-inherence and a true integration. But the marvel is that it will not diminish any individual science. It will only enhance every level and allow every level to become exactly what it should be. Just as Jesus is the personalizing person who doesn't diminish our personality, this kind of co-inherence or integration will actually be the same kind of effect on every science that it touches.
Yeah.
So I tell my friend Kerry, spelled differently than mine, who studies those algae, you know, there's a place for you and your love of algae in the new creation.
That's good. That's good. I'm going to move you on to point 3, which is the third major point of this chapter, pages 94 to 109. So it's more than a few pages discussing toward a transformed natural theology. So here he's wanting to paint some pictures for us of a way forward. So transformed, again, we've talked a little bit about that, but there's something about that Torrance feels that he has that will make a contribution to what's going on. So you've mentioned the red flag to be shaken in front of charging bulls. I mean, tell me about why that is such the case.
Oh, because natural theology in the traditional form is so common, just such a subtle, insidious temptation for those who love nature and love the sciences. We just want to bring it with us into our theological thinking without care. You know, it's an amateur mistake, and then we can get hardened in it, and it just goes downhill from there.
Yeah.
So that's one.
And why have we not been able to convince them that Bart and the Torrances loved nature, loved the beauty of the earth? I mean, I took hikes with J.B. Torrance in the mountains, and he was, you know, full of wonder and joy and delight. It's like, this person loves nature. There's no way you can say that this person, of course, Bart in the Swiss Alps, loved the Swiss Alps. And so how do we quickly draw people away from the red flag of it and say, now Bart believed that we shouldn't do natural theology, but don't mistake it for, and then here's the way you might think forward. I mean, how would you help get them redirected in that?
Do you know the quote in the middle of this Church Dogmatics somewhere? Here, I can pull it up. Church Dogmatics 3.4, page 352. A really good horseman cannot possibly be an ungodly person. It's in the Church Dogmatics. Bart loved horses.
Yes.
So did TF. Bob Walker tells me that TF loved horses. And anyway, yes.
In Bart's office, he has elephants everywhere. He has, you know, little statues of elephants all over it. I've asked a number of people, what's with the elephants? Nobody has been able to tell me, but there's got to be a story there.
Yeah, there
As
must.
well, it's another part of this love of creation and the elephant. And other than maybe it's the elephant and the whale, and he saw himself as the elephant. I don't know.
Yeah. This handout was not about catechizing knowledge per se, but I did work into the summary a long paragraph at the end of section 3.2 that says this interdisciplinary approach to theology and science offers a basis for a more profound dialogue than is possible with traditional natural theology. But there's a line in there that says, it's really talking about cataphysin knowing, and it says, it's right in the middle. A realist epistemology in which knowing is an inherently personal and ethical act requiring continual repentant rethinking.
Hmm.
Most of us just aren't up to the rigor of ongoing repentant rethinking. So
Yeah.
we tend to approach knowing as a simple cognitive exercise, when in a cataphysin model, to know something is a continual embrace of the other,
Hmm.
something other than ourselves and our preconceptions, so that we can be shaped by it.
Hmm.
And openness to reality in that way is so hard. It's a spiritual formation.
Yeah.
And most of us just aren't that far along
Yeah.
in it.
And the use of the word mystery at some level is that it's mystery. J.B. Torrance said, mystery is not the unsolvable thing or the solvable thing, like a written book mystery or a movie that's a mystery where it gets solved in the end. It's the mystery that keeps on giving. It's the openness to a place where you will ever afresh learn more and more deeply about the nature of reality. So
Yes,
that kind of orientation in mystery is a scientific kind of attitude with
yes.
all the wonder
I'll
that we
pair
can
that
find.
with Malcolm Guite, who says that a mystery is that on which the last word can never be said. And I think that would be the case for any of the great scientists thinking about what they study. They're
Yeah.
not thinking they've wrapped it up and tied it with a bow.
Yeah.
They're really aware that existence and the order of nature is goes way beyond what we capture in our words and our theories and in our scientific understanding.
Yeah. So at the bottom of page 7, you have distinguished for us I think this is your new use of a word, relational over against traditional. So traditional is the wrong road, relational is back on the right road.
Yeah, and I'm trying to
So I
use
love the
that.
word relational, of course, but
Thank you. Yes, and I'm trying to use that with an explicit reference to the tradition of discussions of the unity and relations of the sciences.
okay. So the word relativity in Einsteinian thinking is to recognize the necessary interrelation and observation and the differences from each of those relational ways of being. It includes that within the sciences. Am I also hearing that it includes the relationality within the Trinity and God's giving God's self to be known in relation as well? Is that also included in that?
I'm sure a fan of onto relations. Yes.
Yes. Good. So
And
you've got
and let me just say that can be a perspective that is implemented in different ways, cataphysin in any natural science. The obvious one might be ecology.
Yeah.
We don't understand an animal by its specimen in the museum. We have to understand it in its habitat and in the whole relations it has with so yeah.
Yeah. Your picture on page 8 then of traditional and relational, the image of reason at the bottom and faith at the top, that one goes through reasoning in the world, and then achieves something of faith through it, which is a kind of a traditional apologetic kind of modality. John McMurray, in his sense of understanding the nature of reason, understands reason itself to be a function of fear, that because we are afraid of not being able to deal with the things that come along in life, the nature of, what's going to happen with weather and can we build in this place, that reason at some level is a function of our fear trying to manage the world within which we exist. But there is this possibility that he also talks about, it's a more Hebrew way of thinking, that reasoning is this thinking out of the nature of what it means to be persons who live well in the world, as persons in a relation. The reasoning of how we are shaped emotionally, and that our emotions shape into something that comes to having had cataphysin in our emotional engagement with the world, starting with a baby that learns to interpret with parents that give words, this is milk, this is water, give me more of that milk stuff. That there's a sense in which reason can be shaped by love, but it's not our Greco-Roman default. Those defaults are based on reason to control the world and our thoughts about the world. And so McMurray lays out just the possibility of what I wonder, I haven't specifically seen Torrance quote McMurray on this, but reason with these different motives, reason from fear and reason from love. And just the nature of the outcome of what comes from that, and that love explores. I mean, somebody who you love, you want to know more of them. Whereas if you're afraid of them, you want to keep them at a distance and say, I know I can do this. And you reason yourself into a manageable kind of way of engagement. And so just to say, to what degree is there something that Torrance does do a lot with, and that is the Hebrew apperception of the world in shaping what it is that science would do, and that a natural theology that begins with faith and reason is like being children who are katafuzen, being taught by the world and those people who gift us with insight to see it, in a way that there is a loving embrace of the world. Call it, wonder. There's a number of words we might use there that really integrate even these things together in a way where the latter almost doesn't work. I mean, it's too separate almost. They're too integrated together to see that. And yet we basically these days discount emotion, and the scientist does not want emotion. It's all got to be objective. But there's a different form of science that I think McMurray points towards, which I wonder to what degree is Torrance really pointing towards that as well in what he's trying to do here. And you as well.
Yeah, from what you've said, you're already down in the second mode here, where the rails of the ladder, one is reason, one is faith. So it's not climbing from reason to faith, it's oscillating on one rung back and forth, where each rung becomes a discipline. And so there's faith and reason and interplay in every discipline. And as Polanyi or even McMurray would say, that personal commitment, that personal mode of knowing that is required in every field. I think it's McMurray. I've seen in McMurray, I believe, the metaphor that I put a puff in here for, that faith and reason are the two wings we need to fly in any science. We don't get...
Right.
So, Tim, you asked about contingent freedom and what would surprise us. A puffin flying is enough to surprise me. I just don't know how they do it. But flying in any discipline, we need two wings, not just one wing. And faith and reason work together. When I began my graduate studies in history of science, one of the reasons I came to OU for that was to be able to study with a then professor in the history of science department, David Kitts. And David was a historian of paleontology. And I remember him banging his fist on the table in a seminar where it jolted everyone awake who wasn't already, when he said, "There is no science without," fist bang, "monstrous presuppositions." And or Aristotle again says, anyone who will debate first principles, don't debate anyone who questions first principles. In a science, you've just got to have first principles to begin reasoning upon. So in this second mode of relational natural theology, as I'm calling it, the rungs on the ladder are disciplines in a vertical relationship. And within every rung, faith and reason are in dialogue, and also horizontally, but also that's the unity of a science. But vertically, in the relations between sciences, faith and reason are also involved. So it's not a climb from reason to faith. It's a dialogue from one discipline to another. And this is what I really believe Torrance had in mind when he uses words like bracket, methodological secularization, completing, especially the word completing. I really believe we're misreading him when he uses a phrase of completing, unless we have this kind of picture of the vertical relations of sciences in mind, which I tried to illustrate with the asteroid impact, how astronomy can complete geology when it's trying to assess, a crater. And so astronomy, in effect, is the discipline that rightly completes the investigation launched in and carried out by the discipline of geology.
Hmm.
And theology has that role, but it's not a completing from reason to faith. It's a dialogue that from start to finish on every level has faith and reason in a constant dynamic.
McMurray would say, in his interpreting the universe, he'd say we have an immediate experience of the world by acting in it, and then we reflect on it. So there's action and reflection on the world. They're necessarily held together. And then we act again in light of our reflection. And there is this, it's somewhat the latter here, but rather than reason and faith as separate things, it's we're always building faith by virtue of engaging, acting, experiencing, reflecting on it, saying, is this right? And then correcting and coming back and acting again. So it's a mutually informing relational building in the world. That's kind of
Yeah,
how he builds his whole theory of knowledge there.
yeah.
And he takes that to persons, of course, as well.
Yeah. Let's never reduce our perspectives to just abstractions cognitively processed. We're talking about whole persons here. Like, for example, Stephen Hawking's avoidance of Big Bang cosmologies. It wasn't lack of information,
Avoidance. He was afraid. He
Yeah.
was shaped by his fears of what the implications would be, which is
that fits McMurray's analysis.
so the top of page 9, you have a picture of natural theology and natural philosophy. And you're making a point by that natural philosophy doesn't go as far as natural theology in a Torrancean kind of way, right?
Right. So, especially in Scotland, where to this day there's a professor of natural philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. Natural philosophy is an enduring discipline. And by its nature, it's one of those few disciplines that's integrating, meaning that it goes vertically among the different disciplines rather than working just within a single box.
Right.
So natural philosophy in the Scottish context is the preeminent integrating discipline. And Torrance is saying natural theology is like natural philosophy, but better, because natural philosophy isn't taking theology seriously.
Right.
So I really see another advantage to the term natural theology for Torrance. First is the Gifford Lectures discourse. He's entering into that. Second is the natural philosophy discourse. And he's entering into that and saying, look, the unity of a science in natural philosophy, that's discussed as what's the interplay between science and philosophy in every discipline. Well, throw theology in there. What's the interplay between faith and reason in every discipline? That's natural theology. It adds more.
Yeah.
And for the relations of the sciences, natural philosophy already looks at how do the different sciences coordinate together and with philosophy. Well, that's really important. But they're still missing out. They need to include theology. So how do different disciplines coordinate together, including theology? And so his term, natural theology, is a way of challenging those who accept the legitimacy of an integrating discipline of natural philosophy to go further.
So you're sitting at a table with all these scientific-minded people, and they say, oh, so you do theology as part of what you do, and you introduce your relational natural theology. Does that open the discussion? Does it what does that do in that conversation for you?
Yeah, if I'm talking to a natural philosopher, I think it opens discussion. If I'm talking to a scientist, I can't even get past history of science. They tune me out right there.
Really?
Oh,
They
yeah,
won't
'cause
even
history has to do with old science. They're working on what's cutting edge. So
unless they took a wrong turn somewhere.
yeah,
Sometimes that would be nice to know.
no, well, Well, let me put it this way. When I talk to a scientific group, which is fairly frequently,
Yeah.
I really emphasize these questions about the relations between the sciences and how they have much to gain by listening to other sciences for exactly the reasons we've been talking about. And that's why when I first came across Torrance and when I first read this book, this is why I found it so exciting. It seemed to me he was in this inner engaging these questions that are my sea that I swim in.
Mhm.
As a historian of science, playing some kind of integrating role across the sciences in a modern research university, Torrance is speaking to people like me.
Yeah.
And I just found it so helpful.
Yeah.
Again, I came to this first before his theology, and then man, his theology
better.
did the same kind of reorientation
Yeah.
for me that this did
Yeah.
for the
So I
science.
distinguish systematic theology from systemic theology in that systematic comes with a system through which you read the text, whereas systemic, like the nature of a human body, has all these interworkings, and you have to acknowledge both the unity and the particulars. And somebody may specialize in one part, but they don't diss the other ones. They just say that's just not my area, but I recognize it's part of the systemic nature of what we're dealing with. And so I
Right.
guess part of the question is that, do you think that's implied in what you're saying? And the nature of what would be lost to acknowledge that theology is part of the systemic nature of our being human.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
of academic discourse. So
And of academic
so
discourse. Yeah.
so
In
it's
the history of
perfect.
academic discourse.
Yeah. So it's perfectly fine for someone to be a one box person and to work specifically just within their own discipline.
Yep.
But if we look at the discipline as a whole, they need to have some people who are working in a multiple box mode.
Yep.
Because eventually problems will arise in any discipline that call out for completion in this way, like that asteroid impact
Yeah.
example from another discipline. And there's always going to be this need for people who are working as a team with people who have other disciplinary expertise.
Yeah.
And that kind of activity has to be present for any discipline to thrive, but not necessarily in every problem or by every practitioner. You don't want the graduate student, for example, to go straddle a bunch of disciplines from the get-go. You want them to learn one discipline well first. So, so this relations between the sciences,
Deepening coordination, as you say,
yeah.
bottom of it. Yeah.
Or one way I often put it is the special sauce that made someone like Galileo so creative, or Newton. They lived in times when you really could be a polymath. Now the equivalent is a research team. We can't do that in one person. We
Or
really need
AI.
people in different disciplines able to create this space where they can have a productive conversation, where questions have arisen that bring them together, but where there's a respect for the different disciplinary methodologies and expertise.
Yeah. Yeah. So it seems like there's a place within theology for that, but the world of science, there's has to be some kind of an Einsteinian revolution, or a Thomas Kuhn, a shift in the scientific paradigm to allow something like that to happen, right? I mean,
Yeah,
the
so
walls.
Torrance, I think, writes with this amazing optimism that it was happening. And
Okay.
maybe in his historical moment, it could have happened. At least he saw evidence in the conversations he had that scientists were receptive.
Yeah.
You know, my friend that I was talking about earlier, I think, did I finish the story? He said, he didn't come back with one of his witty rejoinders, and he didn't, the conversation was over. He just quietly absorbed it a bit and then commented on the food. So,
Hmm.
so, not having outright hostility was progress.
Yeah. Well, that
I think there's a big difference between the headlines that scientists make and actually talking to the elite level scientists who have more humility about their work because they're standing face to face with the mysteries you were describing earlier.
yeah.
Um, Oftentimes they're more open than we would think just by listening to the quote new atheist megaphones that are out there. The people who are doing creative work but not selling lots of books trumpeting the power of science to solve everything.
Yeah.
There's still, I think, real openness at that kind of level for this kind of dialogue.
Yeah. So on page 13, you've got another picture of contingent order with Katafusen. This is, I think, you're unpacking from Space, Time, and Resurrection, just moving on what Torrance is meaning by bracketing. And so this is your illustration. And bracketing did catch me when I went through. It's like, okay, what does that mean? So can you just, verbalize a little bit of how to understand Torrance's use of the word bracketing in this context?
Yeah, I think it's really important because we've probably seen, everybody in this group has seen examples of that interpreted as methodological naturalism. He's saying, don't be a Christian when you're doing your work. I think that's misleading. It can be seen as do science on your own and then reason to God. This could be endorsing natural theology or an incipient one. I just don't think that's the case. Read it with this stratification of the sciences in mind, and it's saying we respect the integrity of each science on its own level.
Okay.
And if you look over in theological science, I'll give you a page number, page 282, which I checked just this afternoon. And I added this to a footnote in the latest version just before we signed on.
Okay.
He uses the phrase bracketing off there to describe particular sciences in the stratified relations. I think
Particularity within the unity.
yeah, that there's contingent order for biology, and the biologist investigates that. And when the biologist is doing that, they're not using the first principles of chemistry or physics or theology for that matter. They're working in biology cataphysin. And that's bracketing off biology because it has its own integrity as a level of contingent order to be understood through cataphysin methods within that discipline. So to do the work of biology, the biologist works cataphysin in her own discipline, but she will work alert to the occasions when a question arises within biology that begins to have ramifications or resonances with another field. It might be physics, it might be chemistry, it might be theology. And so the biologist is going to come right up to the edge of the box, but realize over there another box has a surface that ought to come into conversation that might actually help her in her work in biology. And
This
so,
is what your asteroid project illustrates.
yes,
If you just do geology without the nature of meteors that might hit and cause something, then you will have lost part of the integrative insight of what considering other options would look like.
yes, exactly. And the same with the word completing. So astronomy completed the investigation that was grounded in and started in geology, but it's not a movement from nature to faith or reason to faith. It's a movement, it's a dialogue between two disciplines. It's a question, a conversation that goes from one discipline to involve another. So
Yeah.
it's two boxes coming together.
Yeah. Matt, I see you've got your hand up there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I just love thinking about that mixing of boxes evangelically. We talk about Christians having a seat at the table and helping people make these. Sorry, I'm getting over COVID.
Oh, bless you. I'm glad you're getting
Thank you.
over it. Good
I'm
to
on the
see you.
mend. but helping people make these connections. I love that point you made a while ago. I feel like we see in this Torrance's evangelical heart in a real sophisticated way, where seeing things as an integrated whole, but coming as you are within your discipline, but saying to somebody who may not even be a Christian, hey, I have this insight. And then anyway, I just think that is a beautiful model for science that seems truly scientific and relational and communal.
Matthew, you've put your finger on it. I really appreciate the way you said it. I like that a lot. Can I mention a shameless plug, but actually, I'd love to share with you.
Yes.
The very first footnote, I think, mentions that these slides and graphics I've pasted in here, I didn't make for this. I haven't had time with a baby in the house, a grandchild in the house, but I pasted them from a number of presentations for a course I taught that Gary helped me teach for Grace Communion Seminary, and it's called Love in the Cosmos. And I'm in my sabbatical, I'm trying to turn that into a book and maybe a few articles, excursions from it.
Oh, that sounds awesome.
Oh, thanks. In this first footnote, there's a description of how to find the page on my personal blog about it. And if you go to that blog page for Love in the Cosmos, then at the very top, there's a link to a preface that I've written so far that describes my aim in the project. And Matthew, it hits exactly what I think you were saying. What I heard you saying is what I'm trying to say in that preface.
So Tim has a comment there also, or a question for you in the comments.
Thanks, Tim. What then needs to be grasped by the untutored Christian in the pew? How can they begin to intuit some of this? Or is it too complex at any level? No, it's not too complex, and it really needs to get to the pew. And I would say the first thing is this approach helps us to welcome the scientist or creation worker. And by that, I mean, quote from horses, the horse trainer, someone who's not a scientist, but is working with creation. Let's make our churches welcoming places for them by engaging them in conversation when they come and not looking at them like they're aliens. For the young people among us who want to pursue a vocation in science or creation work, we can offer them perspectives that will reinforce a deep sense of calling, like that friend who's studying the algae and telling her that is worth your time as a Christian, to understand these algae that nobody else has understood in the history of the world. Okay? You're giving voice to the algae's praise. That should not be missing from the universe, someone to give voice to the algae's praise. So I think maybe that might be anything. You remember, I'm sure everyone here is familiar that when Torrance talks about the different levels of the Trinity, there's the doxological experience, then there's the kind of biblical systematization of it, and then the economic Trinity, and then there's the ontological Trinity that gives us even more of the reason why. But he emphasizes, and what's common with the stratification we've been talking about is each level up gives the reason why for things that are just known as a pattern in the down below. So they're related. But Torrance, whenever he talks about stratification, he's at pains to say the higher levels aren't the most important. We're to hold them together with that realm of daily experience, that doxological experience. That's the reality, and the higher levels are to give us greater depth in that day-to-day experience. That day-to-day experience is what needs to happen in our churches.
Very good. On your
So
page,
seek out those conversations.
Thanks, Kerry. Thank you. Thanks,
on your
Kerry.
page
Thank
15,
you.
Thanks,
which
Tim.
is
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
15, talking about this symposium, at the bottom I just wrote, I'm going on an adventure. That, the nature of what you're inviting into in this study of geology and the history of the world, that it's all about really entering into the adventure of what it means to be human in the world. And at some level, that's what Torrance is really wanting to open up, is the adventure of what living in God's world with God and investigating and understanding with God's people and with others who are also on adventures is really, in a sense, what it's all about. Sir Ken Robinson says that education makes us dumb when it tries to conform us to the boxes of what has been. If we taught people to think critically and become creative about what is possible in exploring the world, we'd have a much better way of engaging what education is supposed to do. And so the whole nature of what it means to know the world, also to know the persons, it requires adventure and investigation, the building of trust, learning common language. Even though we have different cultures we come from, we can find ways to bridge those. I mean, I hear lots of bridging and integrating, and the conversations to do all of that is that community that I think is being pointed toward. So to say this chapter invites us not to see natural theology merely as a tool that's supposed to get us somewhere of getting a grasp of God. It's really an invitation into a full, rich engagement as a community in who God is and the world that God has created in such a way that we don't see anything apart from the others, and that each provides meaning and insight for the others as well.
Well said. The only thing I would add to that is it's essential, I think, to always explain what we mean by natural theology. Let's assume that if we use that phrase, that the listener will think traditional natural theology and then run with it, believing we're affirming that. So Torrance, in his Scottish context, had a case for using transformed natural theology. But boy, I'm not in Torrance's Scottish context. I don't think I'll use the phrase natural theology myself.
But you might use relational natural theology.
Yeah, or relational perspectives, something that this unity and relations of the sciences is an established topic for people who study the history of science or the philosophy of science. Anything that gets us closer to realizing, oh, this is a modernized, revitalized approach to that whole tradition, then we've got a lot to build from.
Yeah.
There's a lot of wisdom in that tradition about the different types of relationships, which ones are productive, which ones are illegitimate incursions, and Torrance is aware of that. If he were writing in America instead of in Edinburgh or Germany or Basel in Switzerland, he might not have used the phrase natural theology. He might have used some other.
Yeah. Matt, we'll take one last comment and then I'm going to sign off.
Just a brief thing. I was walking past some construction workers yesterday as I was after I dropped my son off at the bus stop, and what came out of me I thanked them for their work, and I said, because they were building some homes, I said, thank you for building the world. And what struck me about that was that's a theological, that made me think of Genesis, right? Just makes you think of our conversation of like, I come to construction workers as a theologically minded pastor who then gives meaning to what they're doing. And then after I picked Jack up from the bus stop later that afternoon, the construction worker yelled across the street, "Hey, thank you for that compliment. It made our day." And I had no idea. It just came out of me. I think Genesis just sort of came out of me, right? In that connection point, reminded me of Mike Rowe, from Dirty Jobs, that kind of thing. But it was powerful. So it seems like a little bit of what you're talking about with this interdisciplinary connectivity around the construction worker and the theological pastor, bringing another layer of understanding as I perceive what they're doing. And then I think enriching their self-conception of their purpose.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Praise God.
Love it.
Good. Well,
Thank you, Matt.
Let me just point out that next week we'll have Paul Molnar with chapter 6 of this book. So he will finish it off in a grand firework kind of a way. So that will be fun. We will be going on the next book that we will look at will be 6 chapters of T.F. Torrance's doctorate, the Doctrine of Grace and the Apostolic Fathers. And then in the fall, starting in October, we'll pick up with theological science, which I'm trying to figure out how to break it up so that we don't have too much to chew on, because it's a thick book to start with. And if you try and push through it too fast, it can cause indigestion and headaches and things like that. So I want to take it in an appropriate manner, but I've already got people lining up to say, I want this part and I want that part. So I think there's a lot of excitement. So we'll go back to Torrance's origin with his doctorate, and then go on to this masterful work in theological science. But Kerry, we just want to say thank you today for your work generally, your work specifically for the T.F. Torrance Fellowship, and just what you brought to the table today, and the work that you continue to put into the handout, and just being an articulate person to help us get at really deep thoughts in a way that are so helpful in building on that and going forward to the other things that we need to learn as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Marty, and thanks to all of you. I think close reading of Torrance is so important, and you all are exemplifying that. So hooray, hooray.
And thank you all for showing up today. We had some people leave. There were lots of positive comments for you, Kerry, just what a rich time this was for them. And so it's been a blessed day, and blessings on you all. And we'll try and get this recording up within maybe 24 hours or so. So blessings on you all.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.